Welcome, dear listener. I'm truly glad you've chosen to spend this time here tonight. Perhaps you're resting after a long day, or maybe you've been scrolling through the quiet of the evening, looking for a story worth pausing for. Wherever you are, and however you found your way here, I invite you to sit back, relax, and allow yourself to be transported to another time, one filled with opulence, revolution, and a queen whose final days remain etched into the fabric of history. Now, when most people think of Marie Antoinette, their minds often go straight to Sofia Coppola's film, with its pastel-colored dresses, rock music soundtracks, and a queen who seems to spend as much time picking out shoes as she does running a kingdom. And don't get me wrong, it's a gorgeous movie. But tonight, we'll set aside the macarons and the montages and dive into the raw, unpolished reality. The Marie Antoinette we'll meet here isn't just a fashion icon or a symbol of extravagance. She's a woman caught in the storm of history, whose every decision and every rumor whispered about her pulled her closer to her fate. Before we begin, I'd love to invite you to be part of this journey beyond just tonight. If you find meaning in stories like these, if you enjoy walking the fine line between past and present, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. These small gestures help keep history alive and give us the chance to keep exploring it together. And so, with the laughter of Versailles echoing faintly in the distance, and the restless murmur of a revolution growing louder with each passing day, let us step into the closing chapter of Marie Antoinette's life. From gilded halls to a darkened cell, from luxury to loss, her story is not only about a queen and a guillotine, it is about the resilience of a human spirit in the face of inevitable change. This is where her journey turns toward its final act. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was not merely a room, dear listener. It was an entire universe meticulously designed to overwhelm the senses and impress upon every visitor the grandeur of the French monarchy. Imagine sunlight flooding through 17 vast windows in the morning, striking the enormous panes of glass opposite them, multiplying each beam into countless reflections until the entire gallery seemed to shimmer with living light. Above, the ceiling soared high, adorned with painted allegories depicting France's victories, virtues, and divine favor, framed by gilded moldings that glimmered in the changing light. The chandeliers, cut from crystal, swayed ever so slightly with the movement of air, casting tiny rainbows across polished marble floors, while the echo of each step magnified the sense of immensity. Courtiers moved with precision, their garments rustling softly, powdered wigs framing their faces in stark contrast to the glint of jeweled buttons and silk ribbons. Every gesture, every glance, every shift of posture was observed, interpreted, and measured. For Versailles was as much a stage for political performance as it was a home, and every inhabitant, from queen to servant, had a role to play. Her days began not in quiet solitude, but with ritualized ceremony that defined the very rhythm of life at court. The lever, the moment when the queen rose from bed, was attended by ladies-in-waiting and high-ranking courtiers, each waiting their turn to assist, observe, or gain favor. To hand her a chemise, adjust her petticoats, or tie a ribbon was a privilege, carefully assigned according to rank, influence, and subtle courtesies that could alter the delicate balance of power within Versailles. Imagine standing in that chamber, surrounded by dozens of eyes and whispers, as your every movement is noted, your every breath carrying meaning. Even the simplest act of dressing was elevated to a pageant, where etiquette and hierarchy intertwined so tightly that any mistake, hesitation, or misstep could ripple through the court with consequences. Breakfast followed in similar fashion, a seemingly mundane meal transformed into an exercise of observation and political theater. Courtiers watched as the queen sipped chocolate or tasted bread and jam, noting not only what she ate, but how she moved, how she smiled, and how she responded to those around her. In this environment, privacy was almost impossible, and ordinary moments of human spontaneity were constantly tempered by awareness of observation. Her love of beauty and luxury has long been criticized, yet it existed within a system that demanded spectacle. Gowns embroidered with silver thread, towering hairstyles, and jewels that caught candlelight like frozen fire were expected, not simply indulgences. Each accessory, each choice of fabric, was a statement to the court and the kingdom beyond. Still, beneath the powdered wigs, laced collars, and silk skirts, Marie Antoinette was a young woman navigating expectations, fatigue, and the desire for freedom. She could be playful and mischievous, laughing at jokes that amused her, tapping impatiently during ceremonies that dragged on for hours, or yearning for a moment where she could simply exist as herself, rather than as the emblem of a nation's splendor. Versailles, for all its grandeur, was also a gilded cage, a space that both protected and confined, that elevated and restrained, and in its polished corridors, the Queen's humanity often remained unseen, pressed beneath layers of performance and obligation. The petty Trianon offered her a rare glimpse of liberation. Nestled within the sprawling grounds of Versailles, this smaller estate allowed her to step away from protocol, to breathe and to reclaim a sense of personal space. Here, she donned simpler gowns of soft muslin and wandered through rose gardens and quiet groves, feeling the grass beneath her feet instead of the cold marble of ceremonial halls. Within her hamlet, a miniature rustic village she had built to evoke pastoral simplicity, she tended gardens, watched over sheep, and played at the life of a shepherdess, a role far removed from her public image as queen. The world outside the gates of Versailles, however, told a different story. Bread prices soared, harvests failed, and the people of Paris murmured, whispered, and eventually shouted their frustration. While the queen sought refuge in flowered walks and tranquil ponds, rumors circulated of her extravagance, detachment, and frivolity. These retreats, meant to soothe her spirit, became instead a focal point for resentment, a symbol of the gap between the glittering lives of the court and the harsh reality faced by those beyond the palace walls. The world outside Versailles was changing in ways the palace could not contain. In the bustling streets of Paris, markets overflowed with people seeking bread, yet scarcity pressed upon them, prices rising higher than many could afford. Mothers cried softly in corners, worried for the health of their children, while fathers argued in taverns, their voices a mixture of frustration and fear. The city hummed with whispered discontent, and pamphlets traveled from hand to hand like secret fires, spreading ideas of liberty, equality, and the questioning of authority. Each story, each rumor, each complaint from the populace began to form a chorus that would grow louder, echoing toward the gilded walls of Versailles, carrying a message that no amount of grandeur could completely silence. Even in the heart of the palace, Marie Antoinette could not escape the weight of perception. Caricatures and political cartoons painted her as frivolous, extravagant, and morally careless. She was accused of extravagance far beyond her means, and of ignoring the suffering of the poor, though much of France's debt and economic instability predated her arrival by decades. Yet symbols and images can often outweigh facts in the public mind, and the Queen became a convenient embodiment of frustration and anger. People who had never set foot in Versailles imagined her life as endlessly decadent, filled with silk, diamonds, and careless laughter, a perception that contrasted starkly with the complex realities she faced daily. Within Versailles, the rhythm of life continued, governed by rituals both beautiful and suffocating. Each morning, the Queen's schedule was meticulously planned, from the private dressing ceremonies to the public audiences in which courtiers awaited her favor, nods, or gestures of recognition. Music drifted from the salons as harpsichords and violins provided an ever-present soundtrack to the delicate choreography of court life. Conversations were measured, smiles calculated, and even laughter could be interpreted as a statement of position or intent. Every day was a delicate balance between personal desire and public expectation, and the Queen's choices, whether of clothing, leisure, or speech, could ripple through the palace, influencing alliances, enmities, and fortunes. Despite the heavy scrutiny and endless obligations, Marie Antoinette found moments of genuine joy and tenderness. She adored her children, playing with them in private corners of the palace, reading to them, and taking delight in their small victories and discoveries. These were moments of human connection that no courtier could witness, moments that grounded her, reminding her that she was more than a symbol, more than a target of criticism, more than a queen under siege by perception. In these moments, the grandeur of Versailles faded, replaced by the intimate warmth of family and the fleeting pleasures of unobserved life. The gardens of Versailles themselves were a sanctuary and a stage. Fountains whispered with the sound of moving water, their arcs catching sunlight and casting ephemeral rainbows upon carefully trimmed hedges. Flower beds formed intricate patterns, each bloom chosen for color, fragrance, and symbolism. Marble statues depicted mythological scenes, frozen in dramatic poses that contrasted with the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft footfalls of courtiers wandering along gravel paths. In these gardens, Marie Antoinette could walk, observe, and reflect, though never entirely free from the gaze of her attendants or the occasional wandering courtier. Even nature, within Versailles, was orchestrated, yet it offered glimpses of serenity amidst relentless formality. The Queen's retreats, though criticized by outsiders, were not merely escapes, they were necessary for her sanity. In the Petit Trianon, and its surrounding grounds, she could experiment with simplicity and domesticity, performing pastoral roles that allowed her to explore parts of herself inaccessible within the ceremonial heart of Versailles. Here she could move without the crushing weight of scrutiny, tending animals, inspecting gardens, and planning private entertainments with her closest companions. Critics framed these indulgences as frivolous or mocking of the poor, yet for Marie Antoinette, they were exercises in control and personal expression, fragments of a human life beneath the crown. Meanwhile, the broader political climate continued to deteriorate. The ideas of the Enlightenment had permeated French society, challenging long-held notions of divine authority and unquestioned hierarchy. Philosophers and writers encouraged citizens to think critically about governance, fairness, and human rights. In salons, debates over liberty and equality sparked heated discussions among the nobility and bourgeoisie alike, while in taverns and streets, ordinary people absorbed these ideas in conversation, in pamphlets, and in observation of the growing inequalities that surrounded them. Each whisper, each argument, each written word contributed to a collective questioning that could not be contained by palace walls or glittering halls. Within this tense atmosphere, the Queen's image became increasingly emblematic of the old regime's excesses. Her love of luxury, her foreign mirth, and her public persona combined into a symbol that both fascinated and enraged the populace. While she continued to navigate the complex routines and expectations of court life, her private moments of tenderness, wit, and intelligence were largely invisible to the outside world. The dichotomy of her existence, a life of extraordinary privilege, intertwined with relentless scrutiny, highlighted the precarious position of monarchy in a society on the brink of revolution. Even in the midst of splendor, Marie Antoinette was acutely aware of her vulnerability. Every letter, every gesture, and every public appearance was weighed for its potential consequences. Missteps could be magnified into scandal, and personal indulgences could be reframed as political betrayal. Yet she moved forward each day, balancing charm, authority, and grace, navigating a world where every smile and every glance carried meaning far beyond the personal. The palace, with its polished marble and gilded walls, was both her home and her stage, a place of beauty, tension, and constant vigilance. As night fell over Versailles, candles flickered in chandeliers, casting long shadows across hallways lined with mirrors and paintings. The gentle rustle of silk and the soft murmur of conversation continued well into the evening, while outside, the city of Paris grew restless. The streets carried the sound of discontent, whispers that would eventually swell into shouts, murmurs that would gather momentum into movements. Within the palace walls, Marie Antoinette navigated her world of ritual, expectation, and fleeting joy, unaware that the tides of history were already moving toward her, toward a future in which the gilded halls and mirrored galleries could no longer protect her. Even the smallest details of daily life were imbued with significance. A ribbon chosen for a gown could signal allegiance. A gesture during a dance could shift the perception of an entire household. Courtiers moved like threads in a vast tapestry, each action contributing to the pattern of influence, prestige, and power. Marie Antoinette, though young and often playful, understood these subtleties, yet she also longed for moments when she could abandon them, even briefly, to experience life unmediated by expectation. These moments were fleeting, yet they defined her humanity amidst the relentless theater of Versailles. The palace gardens, fountains, and statues created a sense of timelessness, yet the world beyond the walls was changing rapidly. Rumors, news, and ideas traveled faster than ever before, reaching even the most insulated corners of Versailles. Courtiers whispered in corridors, philosophers debated in salons, and pamphlets circulated clandestinely, spreading notions that challenged the foundations of authority and tradition. Within this shifting landscape, Marie Antoinette continued her carefully choreographed existence, a life of beauty, ceremony, and private reflection, poised unknowingly on the edge of the coming storm. Amidst all this, the Queen found moments of solace in music and art. Harpsichords played softly in private chambers, paintings captured fleeting emotions, and letters written to friends and family provided a channel for thought and sentiment that could not be expressed publicly. These small acts of personal engagement revealed her intelligence, her empathy, and her creativity, counterbalancing the caricatures that would later dominate public perception. They remind us that behind every historical symbol lies a complex human being, navigating circumstances often beyond her control. Even in her most isolated moments, she was never entirely free from observation. Every action, whether in the halls of the palace or in the gardens of the petty Trianon, was susceptible to scrutiny, interpretation, and rumor. The tension between personal desire and public expectation created a life of constant negotiation, of balancing joy and duty, of seeking fleeting freedom in spaces carefully designed to confine. Yet through these pressures, Marie Antoinette displayed resilience, adaptability, and a quiet determination to claim moments of humanity amidst the rigid structures surrounding her. The interplay of beauty, ritual, and tension defined Versailles and the life of its queen. Candles, mirrors, fountains, and gardens created an environment simultaneously enchanting and oppressive, a place where delight and fear coexisted. In this delicate balance, Marie Antoinette navigated her youth and maturity, her public persona and private self, her triumphs and her vulnerabilities. Every day, every hour, every gesture carried significance, weaving together the intricate tapestry of a life poised at the intersection of history and personal experience. And so, dear listener, as the days passed within Versailles, the palace shimmered with gold and light, yet beneath its surface, the undercurrents of change were growing stronger. The elegance, the music, the laughter, all coexisted with whispers of unrest, murmurs of discontent, and the looming presence of revolution. Marie Antoinette lived amidst this duality, a young woman enmeshed in beauty, ceremony, and expectation, moving through a world that dazzled and constrained in equal measure, unaware of the profound upheavals already gathering beyond the palace gates. The first murmurs of discontent began softly, almost imperceptibly, like the rustling of leaves before a storm that no one could yet name. In the winding streets of Paris, the market stalls overflowed with goods, yet scarcity pressed upon the people, gnawing at their patience and fueling quiet conversations of worry and indignation. Mothers clutched the hands of children whose small faces betrayed hunger, their eyes reflecting fear and uncertainty, while fathers spoke in hushed tones at cafes, debating rising bread prices, failed harvests, and the seeming indifference of the monarchy. The air was thick with the mingling scents of smoke, baked bread, and the damp earth of narrow alleys, each aroma carrying with it stories of struggle and survival. Pamphlets and clandestine writings slipped from hand to hand, spreading ideas that questioned authority, liberty, and justice, carrying an energy that was invisible yet palpable, like wind stirring the surface of a calm pond before waves gather momentum. From the windows of Versailles, Marie Antoinette could observe the structured gardens, fountains reflecting sunlight, and marble floors shining under the chandeliers. Yet she must have sensed that beyond the palace gates, a subtle, inexorable force was gathering, one that could not be contained by walls, mirrors, or gilded opulence. The Queen's daily routine continued with all its ceremonial precision, yet the air around her was laden with tension, almost imperceptible, but pressing nonetheless. Courtiers arrived with news of disturbances in Paris, and their conversations, once filled with gossip about fashion, alliances, and amusements, now included veiled discussions of politics, unrest, and subtle warning. Advisers approached with careful words, measured and polite, their eyes flickering toward her reaction as though her slightest response could shift the delicate equilibrium of power. In private moments, she must have felt a peculiar combination of disbelief, anxiety, and the creeping realization that Versailles, with all its splendor, could not insulate her from what was stirring outside. Every footstep in the marble halls, every measured bow, and every whisper between courtiers carried unspoken meaning, reflecting a world slowly tilting away from the certainty she had known, a world where privilege and spectacle could no longer shield one from consequence. In the salons of Versailles, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment began to seep through, subtly, yet with growing force. Philosophers debated the rights of citizens, the morality of absolute authority, and the possibility of new forms of governance. Words like liberty, equality, and justice filled the air, discussed in polite tones, yet carrying the power to undermine centuries of tradition. Marie Antoinette, steeped in the rituals and grandeur of the Austrian and French courts, could comprehend these ideas, perhaps even appreciate their intellectual merit. Yet their full weight on an increasingly restless populace was something she could only begin to sense. Within the palace, the music played, chandeliers glittered, and courtiers glided across polished floors. But beyond the gates, the undercurrent of discontent gathered strength, moving invisibly through workshops, taverns, and homes, carrying with it the promise of confrontation and change that no mirror, no gilded frame could contain. Even within the beauty and order of Versailles, Marie Antoinette's image began to shift, transformed by rumor, caricature, and public opinion. Satirical pamphlets circulated depicting her as frivolous, greedy, or morally negligent, exaggerating her indulgences and distorting the private choices she made for comfort or happiness. Each gown, hairstyle, and ornament, once expressions of courtly expectation or personal taste, was now a symbol, magnified and interpreted as a statement about the monarchy's indifference to the struggles of ordinary people. This duality, the tension between the life she actually lived and the life imagined for her by the public, must have weighed heavily on her. Every smile, every gesture, every conversation was imbued with additional layers of meaning, creating a sense of constant performance in which the Queen's humanity was often lost beneath the weight of history in the making. Even in moments of quiet reflection in her private chambers or wandering the gardens of the petty Trianon, she could not fully escape the ever-looming perception of judgment, a presence as tangible and pressing as the marble floors or the gilded ceilings around her. In her private retreats to the petty Trianon, Marie Antoinette sought refuge from the constant scrutiny that defined her life at Versailles. Nestled amidst meticulously arranged gardens and winding paths, this small palace allowed her to move through space with a sense of freedom unknown within the gilded halls. Here, the scent of roses, freshly turned earth, and the delicate aroma of morning dew offered a calmness almost absent from her daily life. She could wander along gravel paths, listening to the gentle trickle of fountains or the soft bleating of sheep in the miniature hamlet she had created, a carefully curated slice of pastoral serenity. Within these moments, the queen could reflect, plan, and imagine herself apart from the rigid choreography of courtly life. Yet even this sanctuary carried the tension of being constantly observed, for courtiers and attendants were never far from her presence, silently monitoring, reporting, and interpreting every gesture. The early signs of public unrest, subtle as they were, began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. Crowds gathered in marketplaces with increasing frequency, their voices a mixture of fear, anger, and determination. Pamphlets, once discreetly circulated, became widespread, detailing grievances, mocking royal excess, and calling for change in a tone both satirical and serious. In her chambers, Marie Antoinette may have read or heard of these developments with a growing sense of unease, recognizing the power of perception and the fragility of authority. Every step she took, whether along the polished floors of Versailles or in the more intimate spaces of the Petit Trianon, seemed to echo with the distant, unseen stirrings of revolution, a rhythm she could feel but not fully control. The juxtaposition of the calm, controlled world within the palace and the growing turmoil outside must have created a dissonance that pressed upon her mind with a persistent weight. Even amidst these pressures, the queen sought to act with compassion and responsibility. Visits to hospitals, convents, and charitable institutions offered moments in which she could demonstrate concern for the welfare of her people, even as her actions were filtered through public opinion and political narrative. Every gesture, however sincere, was scrutinized and interpreted, magnifying minor details into symbols of moral or political significance. While she engaged in these acts of charity, the gap between her perception of her duties and the public's perception of her behavior widened, creating an almost impossible balancing act. Marie Antoinette lived in a constant negotiation between personal desire, public expectation, and the relentless machinery of rumor, each day demanding an intricate performance that few could fully appreciate or understand. The air within Versailles grew taut with anticipation and subtle anxiety. Courtiers moved with a quiet vigilance, observing not only the queen but also each other, interpreting shifts in behavior, alliances, and loyalties. Conversations carried hidden meanings, and a gesture that seemed trivial could ripple across the court, reshaping perceptions and social hierarchies. Outside the palace, the city of Paris became increasingly restless, and the undercurrent of discontent that had begun as whispers now gathered volume, manifesting in protests, heated debates, and visible frustration. For Marie Antoinette, the simultaneous worlds of private refuge and public expectation became ever more entangled. The Petit Trianon, the mirrored halls, the gardens, and the salons were no longer purely spaces of beauty or reflection. They were arenas in which the delicate interplay of image, action, and perception could shape the course of events far beyond her immediate control. As news from Paris became increasingly urgent, the queen could no longer ignore the reality pressing against the palace gates. Reports of riots, angry crowds, and organized protests traveled quickly, often arriving with an air of urgency that unsettled even the most seasoned courtiers. Within Versailles, the polished floors, gilded mirrors, and glittering chandeliers continued to reflect beauty and order, yet each footstep, each conversation, and each whispered warning carried a tension that could not be masked by opulence. Marie Antoinette faced the growing realization that the world beyond her, sanctuary of gardens and ceremonial halls, was moving inexorably toward a confrontation that could not be mediated by etiquette or performance. Every step she took through the corridors seemed weighted with significance, her presence a symbol both of stability and of everything the public increasingly resented. The contrast between the gilded life of the palace and the struggles of the people became ever more pronounced. Citizens spoke openly of hunger, taxation, and inequality, and the Queen's image was inextricably tied to these grievances, whether fairly or not. Satirical pamphlets and caricatures depicted her in exaggerated forms of luxury, frivolity, and indifference, each illustration magnifying perceived excess into emblematic moral failure. For Marie Antoinette, the human reality of these criticisms must have clashed painfully with her lived experience. She moved carefully, acted with thought, and sought moments of genuine care, yet perception increasingly outweighed reality. Within the mirrored halls, her reflection reminded her of her physical presence, but it could not reflect the growing tide of public opinion that framed her as an object of disdain and suspicion. Even as the social and political pressures mounted, Marie Antoinette sought moments of personal grounding through her family, art, and music. In private, the laughter of her children, the gentle strain of a harpsichord, or the soft turning of pages in books offered fleeting refuge from the mounting storm. These were spaces in which she could reclaim her identity, even temporarily, and find solace in the ordinary human experiences that were otherwise denied to a queen constantly observed and judged. Yet even these moments were tinged with awareness, the knowledge that her sanctuary existed within a fragile cocoon of control, that beyond its walls the world was changing, and that no measure of grace, charm, or careful conduct could fully shield her from the consequences gathering in the streets of Paris. The early stages of revolution were subtle yet insistent, like a tide pressing against rocks long before the waves crash. Crowds gathered in marketplaces, voices rising from murmur to shout, expressing anger, fear, and hope all at once. Discussions that began in private homes and taverns gradually became public, articulating grievances with clarity and moral urgency. Even at Versailles, these currents could be felt, not as loud proclamations, but as an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, a tension that made courtiers more watchful, servants more cautious, and the Queen herself more reflective. Every gesture, every conversation, every appearance carried implications beyond its immediate context, and Marie Antoinette moved through her gilded existence with increasing consciousness that her role as queen was becoming inseparable from the symbol she represented to a society on the brink of transformation. Even within the meticulously maintained gardens of Versailles, the growing unrest outside began to cast a subtle shadow over the Queen's sanctuary. The fountains continued to whisper, the roses bloomed in careful patterns, and the marble statues gleamed under sunlight. Yet the delicate harmony of these spaces could not mask the tension in the corridors and salons. Courtiers moved with heightened awareness, their conversations measured and their glances sharper, as though each action might presage a shift in fortune or favor. Marie Antoinette, walking among her carefully curated flowers or along gravel paths that crunched softly beneath her steps, must have felt the weight of dual realities pressing upon her, one of cultivated beauty, music, and ceremony, and another of social upheaval, rumor, and an increasingly volatile populace pressing ever closer to Versailles gates. The Queen's private reflections grew more frequent, her thoughts often returning to the juxtaposition of her sheltered life and the stark realities faced by the people she ruled. In moments of solitude, she could imagine the narrow, crowded streets of Paris, the families struggling to find food, the artisans and laborers whispering their frustrations in cafes and workshops. Each report that reached her chambers, whether through advisers or courtiers, painted a mosaic of unrest, dissatisfaction, and growing momentum that no palace wall could fully contain. The tension was not abstract. It was present, tangible, and pressing, a subtle vibration in the air that threaded its way through every corridor, every salon, and every reflective surface, reminding her that the gilded world of Versailles was increasingly fragile. Rumors, once ephemeral and distant, now carried the weight of potential action. Every pamphlet mocking the Queen, every caricature portraying her extravagance, Every whispered criticism growing louder in Parisian cafes contributed to a collective perception that no amount of charm, elegance, or personal grace could counteract. Marie Antoinette was becoming, unwillingly, a symbol of inequality and oppression, a living emblem for frustrations that had built up over decades of economic hardship and political mismanagement. Each day brought a heightened awareness that her image, once carefully crafted and controlled within the palace, had taken on a life of its own, traveling through streets, markets, and homes, shaping the minds and feelings of citizens she might never meet. Even as these pressures mounted, Marie Antoinette displayed moments of remarkable resilience and composure. She continued to fulfill her duties, attend ceremonies, and maintain the rituals that defined her existence, all while seeking pockets of personal solace within music, art, and the intimate company of her children. Each moment of tenderness, each smile shared with her family, offered a reprieve from the relentless scrutiny and the rising tide of discontent beyond Versailles. Yet, with every passing day, the dual realities she inhabited, the gilded, ritualized world of court and the growing unrest of the streets, grew increasingly difficult to reconcile. The whispers of change, once faint and distant, had become unmistakable, threading their way into the palace and into the consciousness of the Queen herself, signaling that the world she had known was beginning to shift irreversibly. The early days of revolutionary action began subtly but with undeniable force, like the first tremors before an earthquake. News of organized protests, petitions, and local uprisings reached Versailles with increasing regularity, carried by courtiers, letters, and messengers whose faces betrayed both concern and urgency. Marie Antoinette, once ensconced in the familiar rhythms of palace life, now had to contend with the realization that the world beyond the gilded gates was no longer a distant abstraction, but an immediate, pressing reality. Every report brought details of angry crowds, confiscated grain, and political agitation, and each narrative painted her as the symbol of everything the populace decried, a figure whose presence alone embodied privilege, excess, and detachment from ordinary suffering. The Queen could no longer imagine that her actions, her choices, and even her silence could exist without consequence. Every gesture would be scrutinized, every word interpreted, and every movement observed as a potential reflection of complicity or disregard. Within the palace, the atmosphere grew taut, like a tightly strung cord, vibrating with anticipation and fear. Courtiers whispered cautiously, exchanging news and speculations, their eyes darting toward the Queen as they gauged how much to reveal, how much to conceal. The once predictable choreography of Versailles now carried new layers of tension, where even a casual conversation could ripple outward, altering alliances, creating suspicion, or inciting criticism. The Queen herself had to navigate this increasingly complex environment with precision, balancing her roles as mother, monarch, and public figure under growing scrutiny. Her daily routine, previously a mixture of ceremonial duty, leisure, and personal reflection, became a series of calculated performances designed to maintain composure while addressing the encroaching threat in subtle, carefully measured ways. The streets of Paris were no longer silent observers of change. They had become active participants. Crowds gathered with a new sense of purpose, their chants and cries forming patterns of protest that could be felt even from the distant halls of Versailles. Pamphlets and revolutionary tracts now carried precise calls for reform, taxation equality, and accountability, and images of Marie Antoinette, once caricatured for whimsy, were now wielded as tools of political expression. The Queen, in her private chambers, must have grappled with a growing awareness of the symbolic power she wielded simply by existing. Her presence, her attire, her gestures all were interpreted as messages in a world increasingly attuned to symbols, signs, and perceived injustices. The delicate boundary between personal identity and public image blurred, leaving her to navigate a reality in which every aspect of life was observed, analyzed, and politicized. Even as the revolution began to stir the streets with organized energy, life within Versailles continued with its measured rituals, though now tinged with unease. Music and banquets proceeded, but the laughter seemed more constrained, the steps in the halls more deliberate, as if the palace itself had sensed the tension pressing against its walls. Courtiers moved with careful attention, aware that the smallest misstep could be interpreted as support or opposition, loyalty or rebellion. For Marie Antoinette, these rituals offered both comfort and constraint. They were familiar, grounding her in a life she knew intimately. Yet they also highlighted the stark contrast between the controlled elegance of Versailles and the chaotic, unpredictable fervor sweeping through Paris. Each day became a careful negotiation between duty, survival, and the desire for private moments of normalcy. In the Petit Trianon, the Queen sought spaces of refuge, trying to carve out pockets of humanity in the face of growing political pressure. Here, she walked among her gardens, tended to her animals, and spent quiet moments with her children, attempting to reclaim fragments of ordinary life from the encroaching world of crisis. The rustle of leaves, the gentle trickle of fountains, and the soft cooing of birds offered temporary respite, yet even these moments were shadowed by the knowledge that the tides of history were shifting, and that no sanctuary could remain untouched by the currents moving beyond the palace gates. The Petit Trianon, once a retreat for leisure and contemplation, now served as a fragile buffer between personal solace and the inexorable approach of societal upheaval. As revolutionary ideas solidified into action, the Queen's advisors and ministers pressed her with increasingly urgent counsel. They spoke of concessions, negotiations, and the need for visible demonstrations of solidarity with the people, each suggestion carrying implicit warnings about the consequences of inaction. Marie Antoinette faced the delicate task of weighing personal belief, public perception, and political strategy. Every decision risked alienating one faction or another, and each act, whether public appearances, charitable gestures, or private correspondence, could be magnified into a symbol of support or neglect. In this environment, the lines between personal agency and public expectation became increasingly blurred, leaving the Queen to navigate a labyrinth of duty, perception, and survival. The first direct impacts of revolutionary unrest began to manifest within the palace itself. Courtiers whispered anxiously about disturbances at the city gates. Soldiers were summoned to maintain order, and reports arrived detailing protests outside the walls. Marie Antoinette's once secure environment felt more fragile with each passing day, her position as both mother and monarch demanding constant vigilance. The rituals, banquets, and daily routines now existed alongside the palpable tension of uncertainty, forcing the Queen to balance the ceremonial with the strategic, the personal with the political, and the private desires of family life with the ever-watchful eyes of history. The voices of Paris now carried a new weight, no longer mere whispers or distant complaints, but organized expressions of discontent, heard in petitions, pamphlets, and the growing throngs of demonstrators. Each report that reached Versailles spoke of barricades, protests, and angry citizens demanding change, their chants and slogans echoing far beyond the narrow streets. For Marie Antoinette, these developments were not just abstract news. They were living forces that threatened to redefine the very meaning of her role. The Queen had once moved through life guided by routine, ritual, and the cultivated expectations of the court. But now every movement, every decision, and every word risked becoming emblematic of either defiance or appeasement, loyalty or betrayal. Even within the grandeur of Versailles, the reality of unrest pressed inward, shaping the environment, the moods of those around her, and the perception of her as both a person and a symbol. The palace itself seemed to respond to the increasing tension, as though the walls, ceilings, and mirrors could feel the vibrations of change seeping in from the streets. Courtiers walked more carefully, spoke more cautiously, and observed each other with heightened scrutiny. Even the chandeliers, gleaming as they always had, seemed to cast shadows that hinted at fragility beneath their brilliance. For Marie Antoinette, the contrast between the controlled splendor of her surroundings and the disorder growing beyond the gates created an almost physical tension. Each day required meticulous calculation, how to appear graceful yet attentive, compassionate yet firm, engaged yet unthreatened. The daily choreography of Versailles now included an invisible, ever-present audience, the people of Paris, watching, interpreting, and judging in absentia. Within this growing storm of unrest, the Queen sought moments of connection and reflection. She spent time with her children, taught them, played with them, and tried to preserve an atmosphere of normalcy amidst uncertainty. Music and art provided further solace. The gentle strains of a harpsichord, the delicate brushstrokes of a private painting, or the scent of fresh flowers in her chambers, offered temporary relief from the pressures that pressed upon her. Yet even in these moments, the knowledge that her life and the lives of her loved ones were entwined with forces beyond her control created an undercurrent of unease. The Petit Trianon and its gardens, though offering privacy and tranquility, could not entirely shield her from the inexorable march of events shaping the city and the nation. The first tangible actions of the revolution began to press against the palace in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Reports of disturbances, angry crowds, and isolated incidents of violence arrived regularly, often with the insistence that immediate attention or action was necessary. Courtiers, once preoccupied with social maneuvering and etiquette, now navigated these developments with caution and concern, their every step reflecting the precarious balance of safety, loyalty, and influence. Marie Antoinette faced the duality of being a mother and a sovereign, her responsibilities to her family, intertwined with her symbolic role as the monarchy's figurehead. Each choice, each gesture, even silence, became charged with political significance, demanding constant vigilance and calculated decision-making. Advisors and ministers approached with increasing urgency, offering plans, strategies, and warnings. Some urged concessions, others counseled restraint, each opinion carrying implicit consequences should it fail to produce the desired effect. The Queen had to weigh these competing voices against her own sense of judgment and instinct, navigating a landscape in which the stakes could not be measured purely in terms of etiquette, wealth, or ceremony. Every action or inaction risked amplifying public resentment or eroding the fragile authority that remained. Within Versailles, the corridors, salons, and private chambers became arenas in which political, personal, and symbolic struggles played out simultaneously, the boundaries between them dissolving in the pressure of historical events. As unrest escalated, Marie Antoinette became increasingly conscious of her symbolic presence in the collective imagination of the people. Satirical images, caricatures, and pamphlets painted her as frivolous, detached, and indulgent, turning minor gestures of leisure or personal expression into emblematic acts of oppression or moral failure. Even the smallest social engagement, a masked ball, a formal dinner, or a stroll through the gardens was scrutinized, reinterpreted, and amplified by those eager to find evidence of excess and indifference. The Queen's awareness of this duality, her lived reality versus public perception, added layers of psychological complexity to her daily life, shaping decisions, interactions, and moments of private reflection alike. The Queen's resilience was tested continually. She maintained composure, attended to her ceremonial duties, and sought to demonstrate concern for her subjects through charitable actions, even as the effectiveness and visibility of these gestures were increasingly questioned. Her private moments with family, walks in the Petit Trianon, and engagement with art and music provided temporary reprieve, but could not fully insulate her from the mounting pressure. The tension between sanctuary and exposure, between personal desire and public expectation, created a persistent, almost tangible strain, one that would only intensify as revolutionary actions began to move from the abstract to direct, from rumor to reality, and from symbolic opposition to concrete challenges confronting Versailles itself. The first unmistakable confrontations began to cast shadows over the gilded halls of Versailles. News arrived of mobs assembling near city gates, their chants and cries punctuating the air with anger and impatience. Soldiers were summoned to maintain order, their presence a stark reminder that the palace, for all its grandeur, could not fully protect its inhabitants from the world outside. Marie Antoinette, once insulated by ceremony and ritual, now felt the weight of history pressing directly upon her. Each report, each rumor, each image circulating through Paris carried the potential to inflame unrest, and the Queen had to navigate this landscape with acute awareness, balancing dignity, authority, and the instinct for survival. The walls of Versailles, mirrors, and chandeliers reflected brilliance, yet they also seemed to amplify tension, reminding all within that the palace was both sanctuary and stage, audience and actor in a drama that had grown beyond its confines. Within the private chambers and salons, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety and speculation. Courtiers whispered cautiously, weighing every detail, every gesture, and every word. The Queen herself moved through these spaces with measured steps, acutely aware that her presence alone could signal loyalty or arrogance, engagement or detachment. Even seemingly mundane interactions, a greeting, a smile, a pause in conversation carried layers of meaning, amplified by the charged environment outside. The tension between personal intention and public interpretation became increasingly pronounced, leaving Marie Antoinette to navigate a world where image and reality were entwined, and where every action could ripple far beyond the palace gates. The Petit Trianon, once a haven of serenity and reflection, now assumed a different role, a space to gather strength, to contemplate strategy, and to preserve moments of personal connection amidst growing chaos. Here, surrounded by gardens, fountains, and the carefully curated pastoral landscape, Marie Antoinette could momentarily distance herself from the symbolic weight of her position. Yet even in this sanctuary, the Queen was acutely aware that events in Paris could intrude without warning. Reports of demonstrations, the distribution of revolutionary pamphlets, and public scrutiny reminded her that no retreat could fully isolate her from the forces reshaping her world. Each step along gravel paths or through flowered terraces carried the duality of private reflection and the unrelenting presence of public judgment. By the end of this period, the initial movements of the revolution had made their presence undeniable. The whispers had become shouts, the distant currents had approached the gates, and the very existence of Versailles as a protected, insulated realm was called into question. Marie Antoinette, balancing her roles as mother, sovereign, and symbol, faced a reality where every choice, every gesture, and every silence had consequences that could no longer be deferred. The court, the palace, and the Queen herself were on the cusp of events that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her life, and the early steps of the revolution had already begun to bridge the divide between perception and action, between ceremonial life and historical transformation. The city of Paris pulsed with energy that could no longer be contained. Streets once familiar and routine were now alive with chants, debates, and the clatter of hurried feet as citizens responded to the growing revolutionary momentum. Merchants closed their shutters, fearing unrest spilling into marketplaces. Artisans paused their work to hear the proclamations echoing through cobblestone streets. The air, previously thick with the mingling scents of bread, smoke, and damp stone, now carried the sharp tang of fear, anticipation, and determination. From the distance, the steady rhythm of Versailles could still be seen and felt: the fountains, the polished floors, the echoing halls, but the pulse of Paris, vibrant and insistent, pressed outward, carrying with it the certainty that the world was shifting irreversibly. Every letter, rumor, and report that reached Marie Antoinette added layers of understanding, concern, and reflection to her perception of the rapidly changing society beyond her gilded walls. Within the palace, courtiers adjusted to the new reality with varying degrees of caution and ambition. Some moved carefully, interpreting each day's events as a signal to secure position or favor, while others whispered warnings, advising the queen of potential threats and opportunities alike. Conversations became measured exercises in diplomacy and observation, each word chosen for its precision, each gesture scrutinized for unspoken meaning. Marie Antoinette, navigating this intricate social web, found herself balancing the ceremonial expectations of court life with the pressing need to understand and respond to the world beyond Versailles. Even the most routine rituals, morning greetings, formal dinners, or strolls through gardens, were imbued with significance, reflecting both her internal state and the volatile circumstances surrounding her. Outside the palace walls, the everyday world of Parisian citizens was transforming rapidly. Families discussed their grievances in homes that were often crowded and poorly ventilated, while workers shared news in taverns and workshops, their voices carrying both urgency and resolve. The social hierarchy, once rigid and unquestioned, was being interrogated at every level. The wealthy and privileged felt unease creeping into their daily lives, while those long marginalized saw opportunity and hope in the collective action unfolding around them. For Marie Antoinette, these societal shifts were impossible to ignore. Every report from the city, every letter from advisors, and every observation of public sentiment contributed to a growing awareness that the world was in motion, and that the structures of power she had always relied upon were no longer stable. Even in the petty Trianon, the queen could sense the subtle but persistent tremors of change. The gardens, fountains, and pastoral landscapes that had once offered escape now served as spaces for contemplation and strategic thought. Marie Antoinette walked slowly along gravel paths, noting the play of light on flower petals and the gentle rustle of leaves. Yet her mind remained tethered to the realities outside, the protests, the pamphlets, the debates that no garden could fully contain. Each moment of quiet reflection was tinged with the knowledge that her decisions, however small or intimate, resonated far beyond the palace walls. The interplay between private life and public symbolism became increasingly pronounced, shaping her perception of her role, her responsibilities, and the unavoidable consequences of inaction. The first signs of systemic change began to appear, even within the carefully regulated hierarchy of Versailles. Military presence was increased, patrols intensified, and courtiers became messengers and intermediaries, carrying news of movements, disturbances, and the subtle shifts in loyalty among the population. For the queen, every detail mattered. The arrival of a rider from Paris, the expression of a minister, the hushed conversations in hallways. Each element of life within the palace became a microcosm of the broader societal transformation, a reflection of the world moving inexorably toward confrontation, negotiation, and redefinition. Marie Antoinette's role, once defined by tradition and ceremony, was now entwined with forces beyond her control, and the perception of her leadership was increasingly inseparable from the collective actions of a restless society. As the streets moved and changed, so too did the palace itself. Daily routines were disrupted, meetings became urgent, and decisions carried heavier weight. The ceremonial elegance of Versailles persisted, but it now existed alongside a palpable tension that permeated hallways, salons, and gardens. Courtiers and servants alike sensed the shift, moving with care, adjusting behavior, and observing the queen with heightened awareness. Marie Antoinette's every action, from her choice of dress to her demeanor in private and public spaces, became a part of a complex dialogue with the world outside. The queen had to reconcile the beauty and order of Versailles with the disorder, debate, and agitation beyond its gates, a challenge that tested both intellect and emotional resilience. Even as the machinery of revolution gathered strength, Marie Antoinette sought ways to preserve humanity within her daily existence. She spent time with her children, engaged in music and art, and reflected on personal connections that grounded her in the midst of chaos. Yet even these moments, though offering solace, were underscored by the awareness that her life was inseparable from the shifting world outside. The world in motion pressed inward, blending private and public, ceremonial and political, creating a sense of urgency and vulnerability that could not be ignored. Every decision, every gesture, and every reflection carried both immediate and symbolic consequences, reinforcing the sense that history was being written even as she moved through the ornate halls of Versailles. The tension from the streets of Paris began to infiltrate every corner of Versailles with increasing clarity. Reports of growing unrest, barricades, and angry citizens reached the Queen with a frequency that made inaction impossible. Courtiers carried these messages with hushed urgency, their expressions betraying a mixture of fear, curiosity, and opportunism. Marie Antoinette, moving through the gilded corridors and mirrored halls, felt the weight of the outside world pressing in, a constant reminder that the ceremonial order she had relied upon could not shield her from social upheaval. Even the polished floors and grand tapestries seemed to carry echoes of distant shouts, the vibrations of unrest reverberating faintly through marble and stone. Every decision, no matter how small, became a potential pivot point between perception and action, and the Queen had to navigate this precarious landscape with both tact and foresight. The Queen's advisors and ministers pressed her with urgent counsel, offering conflicting strategies for engagement, negotiation, and preservation of authority. Some emphasized the need for visible gestures of solidarity with the populace, while others advocated restraint, fearing that overt action might provoke further unrest. Each suggestion carried implicit consequences, and Marie Antoinette had to weigh personal conviction against political necessity. The balance between demonstrating compassion, maintaining dignity, and avoiding the appearance of weakness became an intricate daily challenge. Every conversation, every movement, and every decision within the palace was imbued with symbolic weight, reflecting the increasingly inseparable link between personal action and public perception. Even as these deliberations unfolded, the streets of Paris moved with a momentum that could not be ignored. Citizens organized, debated, and acted with growing confidence, their voices amplified by pamphlets, newspapers, and public discourse. The economic pressures, long simmering beneath the surface, now erupted in collective expression, and the monarchy's perceived detachment became a focal point of criticism. For Marie Antoinette, the symbolic nature of her presence as queen became ever more pronounced. Her image, her attire, and even her private gestures were scrutinized and interpreted by a society attuned to symbols and meaning. The palace, once insulated by ceremony and tradition, now served as a stage upon which the world beyond its walls could project expectations, grievances, and hopes. The Petit Trianon, traditionally a refuge of tranquility and personal freedom, became a space for strategic reflection as the world shifted around it. The gardens, fountains, and pastoral landscapes offered temporary solace, yet even here, the Queen could not ignore the currents pressing inward from Paris. Each stroll along gravel paths, each pause beneath flowering trellises, and each glance toward the distant horizon carried an awareness that no sanctuary, however carefully curated, could fully contain the forces of change. The delicate beauty of the gardens contrasted sharply with the turbulence beyond, reinforcing the tension between the private life of the Queen and the political realities demanding her attention. Daily routines at Versailles grew increasingly complex. Ceremonies, banquets, and public appearances continued, but they were now conducted under the constant scrutiny of an anxious and changing court. Courtiers walked with care, aware that missteps could alter perceptions or loyalties. Each gesture by Marie Antoinette became a signal in the intricate communication between palace and populace, her actions interpreted as endorsements, reprimands, or indications of intent. The Queen's awareness of this symbolic weight shaped her behavior, her interactions, and her reflections, requiring a constant calibration of personal desire against public necessity. Even amidst the pressures, Marie Antoinette sought moments of private connection and human grounding. Time spent with her children, engagement with music and art, and quiet reflection offered temporary relief from the relentless scrutiny of the world outside. Yet each of these moments was shadowed by an acute understanding that her life and choices were inseparable from the currents moving through Paris. The private and public spheres intertwined in ways that left no space untouched by historical forces, and the Queen's ability to act was always measured against a backdrop of expectation, rumor, and potential consequence. The palace, once a symbol of stability and tradition, became a mirror reflecting the instability of society. Reports of unrest, collective action, and public dissatisfaction arrived with increasing frequency, each one shaping decision-making and heightening awareness of vulnerability. Marie Antoinette's perception of her role evolved. No longer solely a ceremonial figure, she now stood at the intersection of authority, responsibility, and historical momentum. The tension between personal morality, maternal concern, and sovereign duty grew daily, a silent but persistent pressure shaping her every thought and movement. By the end of this period, the world within Versailles and the world outside had begun to converge in tangible ways. The court, the Queen, and the palace itself were no longer insulated from the revolutionary forces reshaping France. Each day brought fresh challenges, heightened scrutiny, and increasingly complex decisions, reinforcing the sense that the world was truly in motion. Marie Antoinette's role, responsibilities, and image were intertwined with the collective energies of a society in flux, and every choice carried consequences that extended far beyond the gilded walls she had long considered sanctuary. Within the gilded walls of Versailles, Marie Antoinette faced an internal struggle that few could fully comprehend. The Queen's mind, long accustomed to ceremonial precision and public expectation, now grappled with forces beyond her control, testing both intellect and resilience. Each decision became a delicate negotiation between personal conviction, maternal duty, and the perception of an increasingly critical populace. While the streets of Paris roared with protest and the voices of revolution grew more insistent, within the palace there existed a quieter but equally demanding battlefield: the court itself. Courtiers and advisors, navigating shifting allegiances and uncertainty, approached the Queen with counsel that was sometimes contradictory, their words carrying hidden implications, veiled threats, or urgent suggestions that she weigh her every move with care. The tension of these private deliberations contrasted sharply with the public composure expected of her, requiring a constant balancing act that demanded both emotional fortitude and strategic foresight. Despite the mounting pressure, Marie Antoinette displayed moments of remarkable composure, quietly asserting authority in ways that went unnoticed by the public eye, but were deeply significant within the palace. She moved through corridors and chambers with measured steps, her gestures precise and deliberate, signaling confidence, attentiveness, and thoughtful presence. Even a simple exchange, a nod, a carefully chosen word, a deliberate silence carried layers of meaning, communicating to courtiers and ministers alike the Queen's awareness of the unfolding crisis and her capacity to respond. These subtle assertions of presence and judgment, while invisible to the street, were acts of courage in their own right, demonstrating the resilience required to maintain control and dignity when surrounded by uncertainty and potential danger. The private life of the Queen became both a refuge and a source of strength. In moments of intimacy with her children, she could reclaim fragments of humanity and joy that the political storm sought to erode. Music, art, and the quiet beauty of the Petit Trianon provided spaces where the weight of public expectation could be temporarily lifted, offering clarity and emotional grounding. Yet even these private respites were tempered by the recognition that no sanctuary could fully shield her from the consequences of history in motion. Every gesture of maternal care, every personal reflection, every quiet moment of solace was imbued with the awareness that her life, her choices, and her very presence were inexorably linked to forces reshaping the nation beyond the palace walls. The Queen's courage manifested not only in private resilience, but also in her ability to confront the symbolic weight of her role with dignity. Publicly, she continued to perform the rituals of monarchy-attending ceremonies, receiving visitors and presiding over court functions with a calm that masked the turbulence beneath. Each appearance required careful calculation to project authority without arrogance, attentiveness without panic, and grace without frivolity. In these moments, Marie Antoinette demonstrated a form of silent courage, confronting not only the scrutiny of her subjects, but also the subtle threats embedded in the advice and expectations of those closest to her. Her composure, while often unnoticed by the general populace, was a strategic and deeply human response to the pressures of leadership under duress. Amidst these internal and external pressures, the Queen also faced moral dilemmas that challenged her judgment and values. Reports of suffering and unrest reached her chambers with increasing urgency, and she was often called upon to make decisions that would impact lives beyond her immediate family. The tension between personal compassion and political necessity was relentless. Every charitable gesture, every act of diplomacy, every interaction with her ministers required balancing empathy with strategy, generosity with prudence. The emotional and ethical complexity of these decisions weighed heavily, demanding reflection, patience, and the quiet fortitude to act with integrity, even when choices carried no guarantee of success or public approval. The world outside Versailles moved in stark contrast to the deliberate, measured pace within. Citizens organized, debated, and acted with increasing determination, each event adding urgency to the Queen's contemplations. She could not ignore the currents sweeping through Paris, the rising demands for accountability, or the collective insistence on change. The challenge lay in interpreting these signals accurately, responding in ways that preserved both personal safety and the dignity of the crown, and maintaining clarity amid the confusion, fear, and rumor that accompanied social upheaval. Each day demanded attention to both detail and principle, blending intelligence, empathy, and strategic foresight into decisions whose consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Even in moments of solitude, Marie Antoinette could feel the weight of history pressing upon her. The reflections that accompanied quiet walks through gardens, moments of private reading, or observation of the petty Trianon's carefully tended beauty were always tempered by awareness. The world was in flux, and her life was intertwined with the forces reshaping society. The courage she displayed was not grandiose or ostentatious. It was quiet, deliberate, and human, expressed through mindfulness, composure, and the careful negotiation of public and private realities. Each day became a testament to resilience, a measured effort to maintain dignity, clarity, and presence amidst an environment that was increasingly unpredictable and demanding. The subtle power of Marie Antoinette's presence became increasingly apparent as she navigated the intricate web of palace life. Every decision, from whom to meet with privately to the tone she used in public audiences, was laden with meaning. Courtiers, ministers, and even visiting dignitaries watched closely, interpreting gestures, pauses, and expressions for indications of intent or inclination. The Queen's ability to maintain composure in these moments was not mere vanity or pride. It was a deliberate exercise in strategy, a quiet assertion of authority that allowed her to negotiate influence without drawing undue attention or provoking open confrontation. Her courage, though silent, was evident in the precision with which she managed these interactions, balancing empathy, awareness, and firmness in a world that demanded clarity and poise under pressure. Within her private chambers, Marie Antoinette reflected on the unfolding turmoil, considering the implications of every whisper, report, and rumor. The complexity of her position required constant analysis, understanding public sentiment, anticipating the responses of her advisors, and evaluating the potential consequences of each action. Her reflections were deep and prolonged, informed by both personal intuition and historical awareness, as she sought to reconcile her role as mother and sovereign with the symbolic weight she carried as a figurehead of an embattled monarchy. Each decision, even one seemingly inconsequential, could ripple outward, influencing the perception of the crown and the unfolding course of events across Paris and beyond. The Queen's interactions with her children provided both solace and grounding, reminding her of the enduring importance of personal connection amid societal upheaval. In the soft light of the Petit Trianon's chambers, she observed their small gestures, laughter, and curiosity, finding brief reprieve from the storm outside. These moments, though intimate, were tempered by the recognition that the world was changing rapidly, and that the stability of her family's life could not be fully guaranteed. The duality of personal nurture and public responsibility created a constant tension, shaping her decisions and reinforcing the necessity of measured, deliberate action in every aspect of life. Even as the revolution gathered momentum, Marie Antoinette demonstrated a capacity for patience and strategic observation. She listened attentively to advisors, filtered competing counsel, and sought insight from trusted confidants, weighing their perspectives against her understanding of public sentiment and her own moral compass. The ability to pause, reflect, and act judiciously became a critical skill, allowing her to navigate moments of uncertainty with both caution and resolve. Each carefully considered response, each measured appearance, and each silent observation contributed to a pattern of resistance that was subtle yet effective, a testament to her enduring composure in the face of mounting societal pressure. The palace itself seemed to absorb and reflect the tension of this period. Hallways echoed with cautious footsteps, salons carried subdued conversations, and even the chandeliers and mirrors seemed to take on a new significance, amplifying both the grandeur and the fragility of the environment. Within these spaces, Marie Antoinette moved with deliberate grace, her gestures and presence carefully calibrated to convey steadiness and awareness. The physical environment became intertwined with the emotional and political landscape, creating a dynamic in which every action within Versailles was imbued with consequence, and where subtle expressions of courage carried significant symbolic weight. Reports from Paris continued to shape the Queen's decisions, each detailing the activities of revolutionary groups, public debates, and the responses of the population to both perceived and real grievances. These messages reinforced the sense that the world was moving beyond the control of any single individual or institution, and that the monarchy's influence depended as much on perception and symbolism as on policy or decree. Marie Antoinette's ability to interpret, prioritize, and respond to these developments became a vital component of her leadership, requiring attentiveness, discernment, and a calm demeanor that contrasted with the rising agitation beyond the palace gates. In moments of solitude, the Queen found clarity in reflection and in the quiet rituals that had long provided structure to her days. Observing the gardens, noting the changing light across fountains, and listening to the subtle sounds of nature offered brief but essential respite from political and social pressures. These interludes were not mere indulgences. They were strategic pauses that allowed her to maintain emotional and mental equilibrium, to consider her next steps thoughtfully, and to preserve the resilience necessary for both public engagement and private reflection. The balance between reflection and action became increasingly central to her capacity to navigate an environment in which the stakes grew higher with each passing day. By the conclusion of this period, Marie Antoinette's courage, judgment, and composure had coalesced into a form of silent leadership. She moved through Versailles and its surroundings with awareness, responding to both internal and external pressures with measured precision. The combination of personal resilience, strategic observation, and subtle assertion allowed her to maintain a presence of authority, even as the world shifted dramatically beyond the palace walls. Her quiet conflicts, internal deliberations, and steadfast determination laid the groundwork for the challenges yet to come, revealing a depth of character that history would remember not for spectacle, but for the endurance of dignity, poise, and human courage in times of profound uncertainty. The atmosphere within Versailles grew increasingly tense, as though the very walls were attuned to the subtle shifts in Parisian life. Reports of organized demonstrations, the formation of revolutionary committees, and the dissemination of incendiary pamphlets arrived with alarming frequency, each message a reminder that the monarchy's authority was under scrutiny from all directions. Marie Antoinette, walking through the familiar corridors and chambers of the palace, could feel the weight of historical forces pressing against her, bending the ordinary rhythm of court life into a tense and unpredictable pattern. Every decision she made, whether public or private, was imbued with potential consequences, each action capable of altering perception, inflaming unrest, or preserving the fragile dignity of the crown. Within this charged environment, the Queen began to notice small but critical signs that the balance of power was shifting. Courtiers whispered anxiously in corners. Ministers delivered reports with a mix of caution and urgency, and even the soldiers stationed at the gates moved with heightened awareness. These subtle cues, which might have gone unnoticed in calmer times, now carried immense significance. Marie Antoinette understood that history was no longer a distant backdrop. It had arrived at the very doorstep of Versailles, and her response or lack thereof would shape both her immediate safety and her enduring legacy. The realization prompted a heightened vigilance, a careful calibration of words, gestures, and decisions that could simultaneously reassure allies and mitigate threats. The Queen's private moments became arenas for intense reflection and strategic planning. In the quiet of the Petit Trianon, she walked among the gardens, noting the interplay of sunlight and shadow on the carefully tended paths, seeking clarity amidst uncertainty. Each pause, each observation of the environment became a meditation on the precariousness of her position and the depth of her responsibility. She considered the potential repercussions of every choice, how a gesture of charity might be interpreted as weakness, how an assertive command might provoke anger, and how silence could both protect and endanger. These reflections were neither theoretical nor abstract. They were vital, immediate exercises in judgment, requiring patience, discernment, and emotional resilience in equal measure. Outside the palace walls, the currents of revolution were accelerating. Streets that once teemed with ordinary life now thrummed with the energy of protest, debate, and collective action. Citizens demanded attention to grievances long ignored, their voices amplified by pamphlets, newspapers, and networks of communication that spread ideas rapidly across Paris. The economic, social, and political tensions that had simmered for years now reached a critical mass, making the environment outside Versailles both dynamic and unpredictable. For Marie Antoinette, the contrast between the controlled elegance of her surroundings and the fervent activity beyond the gates underscored the fragility of her position and the immediacy of the challenges she faced. The Queen's interactions with her advisors and courtiers became increasingly delicate and strategic. Each suggestion, warning, or proposal was carefully weighed against both internal values and external realities. She discerned subtle cues, shifts in tone, hesitation in speech, changes in demeanor that informed her understanding of loyalty, ambition, and potential betrayal. The complexity of these dynamics required continuous attention. Marie Antoinette had to negotiate influence, maintain authority, and anticipate the repercussions of every action while preserving composure under mounting pressure. These moments demanded a kind of courage that was quiet, measured, and profoundly human. The ability to act decisively without spectacle, to respond thoughtfully amidst uncertainty, and to balance personal safety with the imperatives of duty. The palace itself mirrored the growing intensity of these shifts. Hallways that had once resonated with orderly footsteps now carried whispers of anxiety. Salons that had hosted lively debate now hummed with tension. And even the reflection of light across gilded surfaces seemed to highlight the fragility underlying ceremonial splendor. The Queen's movements within this environment became both symbolic and practical, each step a navigation of complex social, political, and emotional landscapes. Every interaction, from formal audiences to private conversations, carried amplified significance, reflecting not only her awareness of immediate pressures, but also the broader currents of societal transformation. Amid these pressures, Marie Antoinette displayed remarkable resilience in private. Time spent with her children, engagement with music and art, and quiet reflection offered moments of stability and insight, even as the world beyond the gates shifted unpredictably. These private interludes allowed her to maintain mental clarity, emotional balance, and strategic foresight, providing the strength necessary to confront the challenges that would soon demand public action. Each day, each decision, and each reflection reinforced a pattern of silent courage, demonstrating that leadership under duress often manifests not in spectacle, but in steady composure, thoughtful judgment, and the quiet endurance of uncertainty. As the days progressed, the signs of impending change became undeniable. The revolution was no longer a distant force. It had arrived at the thresholds of Versailles, altering routines, relationships, and the very fabric of courtly life. Marie Antoinette's role, once largely ceremonial, was now inextricably bound to these broader movements, requiring constant awareness, nuanced decision-making, and a form of courage that combined intellect, empathy, and restraint. Each action, each word, each glance carried weight, and the subtle dynamics of power, loyalty, and perception became both an arena of conflict and a platform for silent assertion. The Queen's ability to navigate this turning point in the shadows would shape not only her immediate safety, but also the historical memory of her final days. The first tangible consequences of the revolution began to manifest within Versailles, subtly at first, and with increasing intensity. The palace, once a place of ceremonial predictability and rigid hierarchy, now felt permeable to the forces sweeping through Paris. Courtiers whispered anxiously in corners, the tone of their conversations carrying a mixture of curiosity, fear, and self-preservation. Ministers arrived with hurried reports, their expressions taut with urgency, bringing news of demonstrations, disruptions in food supply, and public unrest that demanded immediate attention. For Marie Antoinette, each message carried the dual burden of awareness and responsibility, reminding her that the world outside was no longer a distant observer, but an active participant in her daily reality. Even the familiar rhythms of court life were disrupted. Banquets, ceremonies, and formal audiences continued, yet they were performed under a veil of tension, as though every gesture could be interpreted as either a sign of weakness or defiance. The Queen moved through these events with deliberate composure, aware that each smile, each greeting, and each carefully measured word could influence the perception of her authority and the loyalty of those around her. The grandeur of Versailles, with its mirrors, chandeliers, and gilded corridors, now contrasted starkly with the uncertainty pressing from beyond its gates, highlighting the fragility of appearances and the precariousness of her position. The streets of Paris were no longer merely a backdrop for distant concern. They became a source of persistent, tangible pressure. Reports of citizen assemblies, pamphlets circulating revolutionary ideas, and increasing demands for accountability reached Versailles daily, shaping both strategy and mood within the palace. Marie Antoinette observed these developments with a keen sense of their significance, understanding that the symbolic authority of the crown was being tested alongside its practical power. The energy outside, fueled by frustration, hope, and collective determination, pressed inward, turning the corridors and salons of Versailles into arenas of both internal deliberation and symbolic negotiation. Within the petty trianon, the Queen sought refuge in familiar rituals, walks along gravel paths, and observation of her children's small routines. Yet even these moments were shadowed by awareness. The world outside was in motion, and no retreat could fully insulate her from its consequences. Each step through the gardens, each pause by a fountain, and each glance toward the distant horizon became acts of reflection and calculation. The beauty and serenity of her private surroundings were juxtaposed against the turbulence beyond, reinforcing the tension between personal solace and the inescapable demands of history. Marie Antoinette's internal deliberations grew more complex as the consequences of inaction and miscalculation became increasingly apparent. Choices that once seemed minor now carried the weight of historical significance, and the margin for error narrowed with each passing day. She weighed the potential outcomes of her gestures, words, and decisions carefully, considering not only the immediate effects on court dynamics, but also the broader influence on public perception and revolutionary sentiment. Each reflection was a negotiation between prudence and principle, requiring both emotional resilience and strategic foresight. The palace itself, in all its grandeur, seemed to mirror the growing instability. Courtiers moved with heightened awareness. Whispers filled salons and hallways, and the polished surfaces of mirrors and floors reflected not only elegance, but also the undercurrent of anxiety and tension. The Queen's every action was amplified in significance, whether in private chambers or public presence. Even the choice of attire, the arrangement of a room, or the timing of an appearance carried layers of symbolic weight, reinforcing the sense that her life and influence were inseparable from the currents of history in motion. Despite the pressures, Marie Antoinette continued to seek moments of personal connection and introspection. She found strength in her children, in music, in art, and in the quiet observation of nature within the palace grounds. These interludes were not mere distractions, but essential strategies for maintaining clarity, composure, and emotional resilience. Each moment of quiet reflection allowed her to evaluate options, anticipate outcomes, and preserve a sense of self that was increasingly under siege from both internal and external forces. By the close of this period, the turning point was unmistakable. The revolution's influence had reached into the very heart of Versailles, transforming both the practical dynamics of daily life and the symbolic weight of monarchy. Marie Antoinette, through silent courage, careful deliberation, and strategic awareness, navigated these changes with a mixture of resilience, intelligence, and empathy. The palace, the court, and the Queen herself were irrevocably linked to the forces reshaping France, and the decisions made in these moments would echo throughout history, marking the beginning of an era in which the personal, the political, and the historical converged with unprecedented intensity. The initial shocks of loss began to reverberate through Versailles with a subtle, relentless pressure that touched every corner of palace life. Courtiers who had once been allies or mere observers now shifted their positions, aligning themselves with emerging factions or cautiously distancing themselves from perceived instability. Marie Antoinette felt these changes acutely, sensing the fragile and conditional nature of loyalties she had long assumed were steadfast. Each whispered betrayal, each hesitant retreat, and every nuanced shift in demeanor illuminated the precarious balance of influence, expectation, and perception that had defined her existence at court for so many years. Even minor gestures, a delayed bow, averted gaze, or unusually formal phrasing in correspondence became potent signals of changing tides, and she learned to read these signs with acute awareness, understanding that the slightest misstep could ripple outward with consequences far beyond the palace walls. The Queen also experienced profound personal losses that weighed heavily on her daily existence, shaping both her private life and her public demeanor. The constraints imposed by revolutionary fervor drastically limited her freedom of movement, curbing her ability to walk freely through gardens, attend performances, or even participate in previously ordinary social gatherings. Her circle of trusted confidants narrowed, and moments that had once seemed routine, sharing meals with attendants, exchanging private conversation with close friends, or even walking through familiar corridors, were now suffused with caution, calculation, and constant awareness of potential scrutiny. The pressure of these constraints imposed a layered sense of loss that touched both heart and mind, a pervasive reminder of the fragility of circumstance and the impermanence of privilege. Every day became a delicate balancing act, a test of composure, awareness, and the capacity to navigate the complex interplay of human emotions, political currents, and personal safety. Amid these challenges, lessons began to emerge, forged through observation, reflection, and the subtle art of survival. Marie Antoinette recognized the critical importance of patience, discretion, and careful assessment of intent in every interaction, whether with courtiers, advisors, or members of her own household. She developed an acute ability to read gestures, expressions, and tones of voice, discerning not only loyalty, but also fear, ambition, and subtle shifts in alliance. Each encounter, each report from Paris, and each note delivered by courtiers became a living classroom in strategy, empathy, and emotional intelligence. These lessons were immediate, practical, and often vital for maintaining authority and composure in a world where misinterpretation or impulsive action could provoke severe repercussions. She cultivated an understanding that leadership was as much about subtlety, observation, and influence as it was about ceremonial power, and that even quiet attentiveness could tip the balance between vulnerability and control. The experience of these losses also illuminated a hidden but enduring source of resilience within Marie Antoinette, sharpened now by adversity and the relentless scrutiny of her surroundings. Even as the palace walls absorbed murmurs of unrest and corridors echoed with tension, she discovered an inner capacity for endurance, reflection, and adaptation that transcended ceremonial grace or superficial composure. She drew strength from quiet rituals, time with her children, walks in the petty Trianon gardens, contemplative engagement with music and art that reinforced her psychological and emotional stability. Each moment of solace offered perspective, reminding her that even as familiar structures disintegrated around her, her sense of self could remain intact, capable of thought, reflection, and deliberate action. These small but powerful practices became the pillars of resilience that allowed her to navigate daily life under pressure while preserving dignity, insight, and a capacity for human connection, even in the midst of relentless uncertainty. The Queen's evolving understanding of her losses also shaped her approach to decision-making, which became increasingly deliberate and contemplative. She learned to weigh not only immediate risks, but also the cascading consequences that could emerge from a single action or word. The interplay between caution and courage guided her every choice, whether it was responding to a subtle hint of dissent from a courtier, managing the expectations of her children, or navigating complex political currents outside the palace walls. Each decision was filtered through layers of observation, emotional insight, and strategic foresight, balancing the need for authority with empathy and the demands of survival with the imperatives of personal integrity. Marie Antoinette discovered that leadership required constant negotiation between vulnerability and strength, patience and decisiveness, and that even minor actions could reverberate with profound significance across the delicate fabric of Versailles. Even as she confronted these challenges, Marie Antoinette found moments of illumination in the small, often overlooked details of her surroundings. The interplay of light and shadow across palace corridors, the rustle of leaves in the Petit Trianon gardens, the subtle fragrance of flowers carried on a breeze, and the quiet, unassuming gestures of children at play offered grounding perspectives amidst uncertainty. These seemingly trivial observations became sources of reflection, mental replenishment, and emotional clarity, reminding her of continuity amidst change and beauty amidst turmoil. In these moments, she recognized that even under pressure, the world retained its textures, rhythms, and surprises, and that attentive awareness could provide both insight and solace. Each detail, whether the way sunlight fell across ornate tapestries or the distant murmur of the city beyond the palace gates, reinforced her capacity for mindfulness, calm observation, and the careful calibration of response. The duality of loss and light became a guiding principle in Marie Antoinette's daily life. She understood that every setback, whether political, personal, or relational, contained within it an opportunity for insight, reflection, and strategic recalibration. The shadows cast by revolutionary turmoil could illuminate aspects of character, leadership, and understanding previously unexamined. She learned to approach adversity not as a purely negative force, but as a teacher, revealing reserves of patience, creativity, and resilience she might never have discovered otherwise. Through reflection, calm deliberation, and subtle assertion, Marie Antoinette cultivated the ability to respond with grace, thoughtfulness, and empathy, demonstrating that even in the most challenging circumstances, measured action and human connection remained possible. The Queen also began to recognize the impermanence of privilege in stark and sometimes painful terms. What had once seemed permanent, the unquestioned authority of the crown, the loyalty of courtiers, the security of daily routines, was now fragile, conditional, and constantly negotiable. Each day presented fresh evidence of this truth, whether through absences, delays, or subtle changes in the behavior and attitude of those around her. This realization, while sobering, also sharpened her awareness and reinforced the necessity of discretion, adaptability, and deliberate attention to detail. Survival in turbulent times demanded not only status, but keen perception, emotional intelligence, and the ability to navigate an ever-shifting social and political landscape. Every interaction, every choice, became an exercise in understanding, judgment, and measured influence, illustrating that resilience and prudence were as crucial as power itself. In facing these challenges, Marie Antoinette cultivated an inner discipline that was rarely visible to those outside her immediate circle. Meditation, quiet reflection, and the careful observation of both human behavior and natural rhythms provided a foundation of mental fortitude that sustained her through the relentless pressures of court and revolution. She became attuned to the subtle dynamics of Versailles, the nuanced gestures of courtiers, the shifts in tone during conversations, and the delicate balance between perception and reality. These practices, though understated, were essential in maintaining composure, enabling her to navigate each day with clarity of thought and a measured response to external turbulence. The Queen's dedication to cultivating this inner strength allowed her to remain centered, drawing upon reserves of patience, insight, and emotional stability that could withstand even the most testing circumstances. The Queen also drew lessons from historical awareness, turning her attention to the lives of past monarchs and the consequences of their decisions. By studying precedent, considering potential outcomes, and reflecting on historical examples, she gained perspective on her own circumstances, grounding her reactions in understanding rather than impulse. These reflections allowed her to see patterns of governance, loyalty, and public sentiment, and to anticipate the possible consequences of her own actions. This combination of reflective insight and practical foresight strengthened her capacity to navigate loss without succumbing to despair, enabling her to act with strategy, composure, and a nuanced understanding of the fragile interplay between personal authority and public perception. Even as the external world grew more threatening, Marie Antoinette found strength in personal relationships that endured beyond political machinations. Trusted confidants, loyal attendants, and close family members provided both emotional support and counsel. These bonds offered an anchor, a reminder that human connection could persist despite upheaval, and that strategic alliances, cultivated with care and discernment, were vital to navigating the turbulent social landscape. Each interaction reinforced her ability to balance empathy, authority, and insight, highlighting that leadership and resilience depended not solely on position or ceremony, but on the careful maintenance of meaningful human ties. The Queen drew courage and perspective from these relationships, understanding that enduring loyalty and shared trust could provide both solace and practical advantage. The Queen's reflections on loss extended to her understanding of personal identity, particularly the intertwining of her roles as monarch, mother, and public figure. She recognized that preserving integrity required careful navigation across these spheres, ensuring that personal convictions, familial responsibilities, and public duties could coexist without conflict. Moments of private contemplation allowed her to reconcile these aspects of self, maintaining coherence and agency even as external circumstances threatened to fragment perception and control. By aligning internal values with external action, Marie Antoinette cultivated a form of self-governance that enabled her to act with dignity, foresight, and resilience, ensuring that her personal and political identities could remain intact even in the face of relentless pressure and profound losses. Through these experiences, Marie Antoinette began to see the subtle ways in which adversity could foster growth. Each challenge, setback, or perceived betrayal carried the potential for learning, for refinement of strategy, and for deeper understanding of human nature. She reflected on the complexities of loyalty, ambition, and fear, and gradually developed a heightened sensitivity to the emotional currents that shaped the actions of those around her. These realizations enabled her to anticipate. The first indications of Marie Antoinette's legacy began to take shape even as the turbulence of her final days continued to unfold. While her immediate circumstances were defined by confinement, scrutiny, and political unrest, subtle patterns of remembrance and reinterpretation were already emerging. Courtiers, attendants, and chroniclers began to document her actions, her gestures, and even her silences, capturing fragments of character that would outlast the events themselves. These records, often uneven and filtered through personal perspectives, began to form the scaffolding of a memory that would endure beyond the immediate consequences of revolution. In these small, attentive acts of observation, Marie Antoinette's presence began to be woven into the broader tapestry of historical consciousness, planting seeds for the narratives that future generations would construct around her life, choices, and influence. Even within the strictures of imprisonment and the isolation imposed by her captors, the Queen's personal impact remained visible in subtle ways. The loyalty of certain attendants, the care of those tasked with her daily sustenance, and the occasional letter or message from sympathetic observers reflected the persistence of human connection and admiration, despite adversity. These tangible traces of attachment and respect signaled that her influence had not been entirely diminished, and that the qualities which had inspired both devotion and critique grace, discernment, composure, and intelligence continued to resonate. Each act of support, however small, contributed to a broader sense that her life, even under constraint, carried significance that could echo into the future. The shaping of legacy also involved the interpretation of her public and private persona. Writers, historians, and artists of the period, each with their own vantage point and agenda, began to construct narratives that emphasized certain traits, some idealized, some critical, some sympathetic, others accusatory. Marie Antoinette's behavior, decisions, and expressions were transformed into symbols, representations, and sometimes cautionary tales, creating a multifaceted portrait that extended beyond immediate events. This process illustrated the ways in which individual lives, especially those intertwined with power, could be transformed into enduring motifs, offering lessons, warnings, or inspiration for audiences far removed from the lived reality of the time. Even in reflection, the Queen's influence reached beyond her own actions to the broader cultural and social patterns of the era. Her tastes in art, fashion, and design continued to inspire emulation and commentary, leaving subtle traces in the aesthetics of the period. Beyond material influence, the moral, emotional, and strategic dimensions of her character began to inform perceptions of monarchy, femininity, and leadership. Observers, both contemporary and later, would evaluate her capacity for resilience, her engagement with adversity, and her approach to personal and political challenges as a reference point, consciously or unconsciously shaping judgments about authority, empathy, and responsibility. In this way, the legacy of Marie Antoinette was not only a record of events, but also an evolving constellation of interpretation, meaning, and influence. As her story began to circulate more widely, the nuances of Marie Antoinette's character started to intertwine with public perception, memory, and myth. Chroniclers and commentators often highlighted contrasts her moments of composure against displays of vulnerability, her acts of charity alongside the accusations of extravagance. These dualities created a layered portrait, one that defied simple categorization, allowing future generations to interpret her life through multiple lenses. Even in the midst of political turmoil, observers were captivated by the complexity of her persona, noting that the interplay between circumstance and individual temperament could produce both admiration and critique. Through this evolving narrative, the Queen's life transcended the immediate historical moment, becoming a reference point for discussions about leadership, morality, and the human capacity to endure. Beyond written accounts, Marie Antoinette's influence began to resonate in art, portraiture, and cultural representation. Painters, sculptors, and designers captured not only her likeness, but the aura of dignity, elegance, and refinement that had defined her presence at court. These artistic interpretations, whether idealized or realistic, carried forward the visual memory of her reign, solidifying her place in the cultural imagination. Each brushstroke, each crafted image, contributed to a collective understanding of her identity, shaping how society would perceive her long after her final days. In this manner, the Queen's legacy extended beyond political or historical records, reaching into aesthetic and symbolic dimensions that would endure across centuries. Even within private letters and personal recollections, the echoes of her influence were evident. Correspondence from attendants, family members, and sympathetic observers revealed an appreciation for her intellect, emotional depth, and capacity for grace under pressure. These intimate accounts preserved the human side of Marie Antoinette, highlighting qualities often overshadowed by political narratives. In reading these reflections, later generations could access not only the events of her life, but the textures of her experience, the careful choices, the moments of introspection, and the enduring presence that shaped interactions and relationships throughout her final years. The shaping of legacy was not merely about preservation. It was also about transformation. Over time, stories of Marie Antoinette's resilience, refinement, and courage began to inform broader societal conversations about monarchy, gender, and authority. Her life became a lens through which the dynamics of privilege, responsibility, and personal agency could be explored, providing insight into the interplay between individual character and historical circumstance. In this way, her legacy was not static but dynamic, evolving with each retelling, each artistic rendering, and each historical analysis, ensuring that her impact extended far beyond the constraints of her immediate environment and into the consciousness of generations to come. By observing how stories of her life evolved, Marie Antoinette's legacy began to take on a reflective quality that intertwined fact, perception, and interpretation. Each account, whether crafted by historians, memoirists, or casual observers, highlighted different facets of her character resilience, elegance, vulnerability, or misjudgment. These layered narratives created a mosaic in which truth and interpretation blended, offering subsequent generations a complex and multifaceted understanding of her experiences. The Queen's own actions, decisions, and composure in the face of adversity became touchstones for evaluating the human capacity to navigate public scrutiny, political turbulence, and personal loss. Through these narratives, her life became a mirror reflecting broader questions about leadership, morality, and the fragility of social structures. Even as historical interpretations varied, the subtle traces of her influence persisted in culture, fashion, and public memory. The elegance of her attire, the refinement of her gestures, and the distinct character of her public presence continued to inspire admiration, debate, and emulation. These cultural echoes extended beyond her immediate courtly environment, shaping perceptions of royalty, femininity, and social authority across France and eventually Europe. In observing the interplay between her personal identity and public image, later generations could discern the intricate relationships between appearance, influence, and perception, realizing that a legacy is as much constructed through symbolism and representation as through concrete actions. The Queen's personal relationships, too, contributed to the enduring nature of her legacy. Letters, memoirs, and oral accounts from family members, attendants, and trusted confidants preserved the human side of her story, revealing her capacity for care, empathy, and strategic thought. These intimate perspectives provided depth to the historical record, balancing political narratives with reflections on emotional intelligence, relational acumen, and the ways in which her decisions impacted those closest to her. By documenting these human dimensions, the contours of her character were preserved in a manner that allowed her legacy to transcend simple heroism or vilification, offering a nuanced portrayal of a life shaped by circumstance, choice, and endurance. Finally, Marie Antoinette's legacy began to crystallize into a dynamic interplay between historical fact, personal impression, and cultural representation. She became not only a figure of immediate historical consequence, but also a symbol through which broader societal themes, power, vulnerability, resilience, and identity could be explored. Each retelling, each artistic depiction, and each historical analysis added layers of meaning, ensuring that her story continued to inform, inspire, and provoke reflection long after the events of her life had passed. In this way, the shaping of her legacy was an ongoing process, one that demonstrated how individual lives could resonate far beyond their temporal and spatial boundaries, leaving enduring traces in both history and collective memory. In examining the lasting contours of Marie Antoinette's legacy, one begins to see how her life's narrative extended beyond political events into enduring cultural symbolism. She became emblematic of both the splendor and the vulnerability inherent in monarchy, embodying qualities that could inspire admiration while also inviting scrutiny. Artists, writers, and historians, each in their own way, contributed to a layered portrayal that balanced her personal virtues with the complexities of her circumstances. Through these evolving interpretations, Marie Antoinette's presence continued to resonate, highlighting the intricate relationships between power, perception, and historical memory, and offering a nuanced lens through which subsequent generations could understand the interplay of individual agency and societal expectation. Even within the private sphere, reflections on her actions and decisions contributed to shaping her memory. Letters from attendants, personal diaries, and recollections of family members preserve intimate details of her character, her wit, her emotional depth, and her capacity for thoughtfulness amid adversity. These personal accounts offered texture and dimension to her public image, emphasizing the human experience behind the ceremonial and political facade. In this manner, her legacy was not solely defined by grand events or public perception, but also by the subtle, everyday expressions of resilience, care, and discernment that left lasting impressions on those around her. Marie Antoinette's legacy further illustrates how personal adversity can amplify historical significance. The trials she faced, the losses she endured, and the choices she made under duress became focal points for reflection, analysis, and narrative construction. Her experiences allowed future generations to examine broader themes of leadership, responsibility, and human vulnerability, demonstrating that the endurance of character under pressure often leaves as strong an imprint as acts of overt power. Through these reflections, she became both a subject of historical study and a symbol of resilience, showing that personal conduct and composure can extend influence far beyond immediate circumstance. Ultimately, the shaping of Marie Antoinette's legacy was a dynamic and ongoing process, evolving through the interplay of observation, interpretation, and cultural memory. Her life became a canvas on which subsequent generations projected lessons, ideals, and cautionary tales, ensuring that the subtleties of her character strength intertwined with vulnerability, wisdom tempered by circumstance, would endure across time. Through art, literature, personal accounts, and historical study, her influence persisted, demonstrating that the impact of an individual is not solely measured by immediate power or success, but by the enduring capacity to shape perception, inspire reflection, and leave a resonant imprint on the collective consciousness of history. As years passed, the memory of Marie Antoinette began to settle into the collective consciousness, taking shape through stories, records, and artistic representations that lingered long after her final days. The immediacy of revolutionary upheaval gave way to reflection as chroniclers, historians, and contemporaries sought to interpret her life with the clarity that distance can provide. Every anecdote, observation, and written account contributed to a slowly crystallizing image of the Queen, one that intertwined public events with private gestures, triumphs with missteps, and human vulnerability with regal poise. In this way, the passage of time itself became a medium through which her legacy could be examined, refined, and understood, allowing both admiration and critique to coexist in a layered, enduring narrative. Even as political upheaval faded into historical study, Marie Antoinette's story continued to captivate the imagination of those who encountered it. Artists captured her likeness with renewed attention to detail, historians analyzed her decisions and correspondence, and writers wove her experiences into narratives that illuminated broader themes of monarchy, societal expectation, and personal agency. The Queen's life became more than a series of events. It became a lens through which human character, resilience, and the consequences of power could be explored. Each retelling, whether through meticulous scholarship or evocative literature, added depth and dimension, ensuring that her presence remained both tangible and symbolic across time. The evolving memory of Marie Antoinette was also shaped by the interplay between myth and reality. As stories circulated, some details were embellished, others minimized, and many were reframed to suit the perspectives of storytellers or the sentiments of audiences removed from the movement immediacy of her era. This blending of fact and interpretation did not diminish her historical significance. Rather, it enriched the complexity of her legacy. The tension between her public persona and private reality created a fertile ground for reflection, inviting successive generations to grapple with questions of justice, perception, and the human cost of political upheaval. Through this process, her life became a prism through which the shades of history, morality, and human behavior could be refracted and understood. Even within personal and family recollections, the resonance of her memory persisted. Letters, memoirs, and anecdotal accounts preserved the emotional and relational dimensions of her life, capturing subtleties of character that formal records often overlooked. These personal insights emphasized her humanity, her capacity for care, her moments of doubt and reflection, and her steadfastness in the face of challenge. By preserving these intimate aspects, her memory was not only documented as a matter of historical record, but also humanized, allowing those who studied or encountered her story to connect with the Queen on an emotional and psychological level. This blending of personal narrative and public history ensured that the memory of Marie Antoinette remained both vivid and multifaceted, accessible to the heart as well as the mind. As the years unfolded, the Queen's life became a point of reference for broader reflections on monarchy, governance, and societal expectations. Scholars and writers analyzed not only her decisions, but also the symbolic weight they carried, considering how personal choices intersected with the responsibilities of power. Each account examined the nuances of her leadership, the subtleties of her interactions with courtiers and advisors, and the ways in which she navigated the constraints imposed upon her. Through this lens, Marie Antoinette's story transformed from a series of historical events into a study of human behavior under pressure, illustrating how resilience, judgment, and personal character can shape perception long after the moment has passed. The process of remembering also highlighted the Queen's aesthetic and cultural influence, which persisted long after her personal circumstances had changed. From fashion and courtly etiquette to art and music, Marie Antoinette's tastes and sensibilities continued to inspire emulation, discussion, and critique. The subtle details of her life, the arrangement of her chambers, the gardens she cherished, the art she collected, became symbols through which future generations understood the intersection of personal taste and social expectation. In preserving and interpreting these elements, historians and cultural commentators revealed how memory is not only about actions and events, but also about the textures, atmospheres, and intangible qualities that define human experience. Even the myths that grew around her contributed to the shaping of memory, demonstrating the interplay between narrative and historical fact. Stories, sometimes exaggerated or reimagined, conveyed the essence of her persona and the societal forces that surrounded her. These narratives, circulating in print, art, and oral history, ensured that her presence remained vivid, if occasionally contested, in the collective imagination. They reflected not only the fascination with her as an individual, but also the enduring cultural desire to understand the complexities of human behavior, privilege, and consequence. In this way, Marie Antoinette's life became both a subject of study and a mirror for the values, fears, and aspirations of those who preserved her memory. Through these layers of observation, interpretation, and storytelling, the Queen's legacy became increasingly multidimensional. Time allowed for reflection on the contrast between her public image and private reality, between the criticisms leveled against her and the personal trials she endured. Each layer added depth to understanding, revealing her as both a historical figure and a human being navigating extraordinary circumstances. Her story demonstrated that memory is not static. It grows, shifts, and gains texture with each retelling, and that the resonance of a life is measured not only by deeds, but by the lasting impressions left on the hearts and minds of those who remember. As public interest in her life endured, the Queen's story became a lens through which historians and cultural commentators could explore broader societal transformations. The tumult of the French Revolution, the collapse of traditional hierarchies, and the emergence of new political paradigms all intersected with the narrative of Marie Antoinette's life, making her an emblematic figure through which change could be examined. Each retelling emphasized not only her personal experiences, but also the social, political, and cultural currents that shaped them. In this way, her memory became inseparable from the broader historical context, offering insight into both individual character and collective upheaval, and demonstrating how personal and societal narratives can intertwine to create enduring historical significance. Even as historical scholarship evolved, the nuances of her personality continued to emerge through careful study of correspondence, memoirs, and archival records. These materials revealed a woman capable of thoughtfulness, empathy, and strategic insight, balancing the demands of public life with personal reflection and familial concern. Such insights allowed historians to paint a more complete portrait, one that went beyond stereotypes or sensational accounts to explore the complexity of her experience. Through these detailed examinations, Marie Antoinette's memory was enriched, revealing the subtle ways in which personal disposition, circumstance, and decision-making intersected to shape both perception and legacy. The Queen's life, as it was interpreted over time, also illuminated the enduring tension between perception and reality. Public narratives, often shaped by rumor, bias, or political agenda, sometimes diverged from her lived experience. Yet these narratives themselves became part of the historical record, influencing how subsequent generations understood both her character and her role in the events of the era. The interplay between lived reality and public interpretation underscored the complex dynamics of memory, illustrating that the lasting impression of an individual is shaped not solely by their actions, but also by the stories told, the interpretations made, and the cultural frameworks that persist long after events have passed. Through this continuous interplay of documentation, reflection, and interpretation, the memory of Marie Antoinette gradually became more layered and enduring. Each account, whether emphasizing her courage, her elegance, her errors, or her resilience, contributed to a rich tapestry of understanding that transcended temporal boundaries. Time allowed for perspective, nuance, and a deeper appreciation of the interplay between personal character and historical circumstance, ensuring that her legacy remained not only a record of past events but also a lens through which the complexities of human experience could be examined and appreciated across generations. As generations passed, Marie Antoinette's memory continued to evolve, shaped not only by historical documentation, but also by literature, art, and popular imagination. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of her character, her resilience under duress, her moments of personal vulnerability, her influence on culture and fashion, or her symbolic representation as a monarch confronted by social upheaval. These layered interpretations enriched the historical record, allowing her story to resonate with diverse audiences over time. The Queen became not just a figure of her own era, but a timeless lens through which the challenges of leadership, human fragility, and societal change could be examined. Even as myths and legends grew around her figure, the nuanced details of her life were preserved in letters, memoirs, and careful historical research. The private glimpses of her intelligence, empathy, and composure added depth to the public narratives, balancing sensationalized accounts with the subtleties of lived experience. These personal dimensions enabled historians and audiences alike to appreciate the complexity of her character, revealing the human behind the crown, the mother behind the political persona, and the individual navigating extraordinary circumstances with dignity and awareness. The Queen's enduring presence in cultural memory also highlighted the interplay between narrative and identity. Her story became a framework through which discussions of monarchy, gender, and societal expectation were explored. By examining how she responded to constraint, criticism, and the pressures of power, later generations could draw insights into the human capacity for endurance, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience. In this way, the memory of Marie Antoinette extended beyond a chronological record of events, evolving into a multidimensional exploration of character, circumstance, and influence. Ultimately, the consolidation of her memory into history demonstrated the lasting impact of her life and decisions. Through meticulous documentation, reflective scholarship, artistic interpretation, and cultural storytelling, Marie Antoinette's legacy was preserved and reimagined, offering a rich, textured understanding that transcended her own time. Her story, shaped by both personal experience and the perceptions of those who recorded it, became an enduring testament to the complexities of human life, the fragility and resilience of power, and the ways in which memory, narrative, and legacy intertwine to shape historical consciousness. Even centuries later, the presence of Marie Antoinette continues to echo through history, literature, and cultural consciousness, reverberating far beyond the temporal confines of her own life. Her story, shaped by the turbulence, drama, and upheaval of her era, resonates as a profound study in the intricate interplay between human character, circumstance, and societal expectation. Each decision she made, each gesture observed by courtiers, each whispered rumor or public commentary, contributed to a narrative that was as much about perception as it was about reality. These ripples of influence remind us that the consequences of a life lived under scrutiny are never confined to immediate events. They extend across generations, shaping the way future audiences understand resilience, dignity, and the fragile balance between personal choice and public expectation. Through the accumulated memory of countless retellings, the Queen's life continues to inform and engage, offering lessons in perseverance, reflection, and the subtle art of navigating a world in which every action carries weight beyond itself. These echoes manifest not only in the careful scholarship of historians, but also in the ongoing exploration of cultural reflection and artistic expression, creating a dialogue between past and present. From the delicate brushstrokes of portraits capturing her composure, to novels that dramatize her inner thoughts, and contemporary film interpretations that reimagine her experiences, Marie Antoinette's life has inspired a wide spectrum of creators. Each representation captures fragments of her character, the texture of her environment, and the layered social dynamics that defined her time, allowing contemporary audiences to engage with the nuanced story of a woman navigating extraordinary pressures. This dynamic interplay between myth, memory, and historical fact ensures that her legacy is not static. It is continually reshaped and reframed, adapting to new interpretations while retaining the essence of her lived experience. Beyond artistic representation, the echoes of her life influence the study of leadership, governance, and societal transformation, offering a framework through which enduring questions can be explored. Analysts and scholars examine the Queen's behavior under extreme scrutiny, considering how personal poise, strategic insight, and emotional intelligence informed her responses to crisis. By studying her experiences, contemporary observers gain insight into the challenges of exercising authority amid scrutiny, the fragility of privilege, and the resilience required to maintain dignity when circumstances threaten both position and personal security. In this sense, Marie Antoinette's legacy becomes an active tool for understanding the human dimensions of leadership, illustrating how character and circumstance intersect to shape outcomes and perceptions across time. Even in the intimate realms of personal and familial memory, her presence remains palpable, preserved in letters, diaries, and oral recollections that convey her wit, her thoughtfulness, and her subtle strategic awareness. These personal records capture the Queen not merely as a figure of history, but as a living human being, navigating fear, uncertainty, and expectation with grace and care. They allow later generations to access the interiority of her experience, the anxieties, reflections, and tender moments that were invisible to public observers, yet essential to understanding her full character. Through these intertwined public and private echoes, Marie Antoinette's memory continues to inform, shape, and inspire, demonstrating that the resonance of a life is measured as much by the impressions left on the hearts and minds of others as by the events that define its chronology. As time progressed, the subtle influences of Marie Antoinette's life extended into broader cultural and societal reflection, illustrating how personal narrative can intersect with collective memory. Her experiences, choices, and comportment became points of discussion not only for historians, but also for philosophers, writers, and social commentators, each seeking to understand the interplay between individual agency and structural forces. In examining her life, observers explored questions of morality, privilege, and the consequences of human action, recognizing that the echoes of her experience provided enduring lessons in both the personal and political realms. Through these reflections, her presence remained alive, a reference point for understanding the complexities of leadership, vulnerability, and the human consequences of social upheaval. The Queen's story also persisted in artistic and literary imagination, her image continually reinterpreted to resonate with contemporary audiences. Each depiction, whether in painting, theater, or literature, captured facets of her elegance, her poise, or the tension between public expectation and private reality. Even when dramatized or mythologized, these interpretations preserved essential truths about her life, highlighting the resilience, thoughtfulness, and strategic awareness that characterized her final years. The ongoing reinterpretation of her persona demonstrates how memory and legacy are living phenomena, continually shaped by perception, creativity, and the need to find meaning in historical narrative. Even within the realms of education and historical study, Marie Antoinette's legacy offers fertile ground for exploration. Her life serves as a case study in the interplay between circumstance, personal character, and societal forces, providing insight into the fragility of privilege and the enduring impact of perception. Students and scholars analyze her correspondence, decisions, and the social dynamics of her court to understand not only her individual experience, but also the broader mechanisms of power, loyalty, and influence. In this way, her story remains a vital tool for learning, reflection, and understanding, bridging centuries to offer insights that are as relevant today as they were in her own time. Finally, the echoes of Marie Antoinette's life remind us that legacy is both persistent and dynamic, formed by the interaction of fact, interpretation, and human memory. Her experiences continue to resonate because they embody universal themes of resilience, vulnerability, and the navigation of complex social landscapes. Each retelling, each artistic or scholarly exploration reinforces the ongoing relevance of her story, ensuring that her life continues to inform and inspire. Through these enduring echoes, Marie Antoinette lives on not merely as a historical figure, but as a symbol of the intricate interplay between personal character, societal expectation, and the passage of time, reminding all who reflect upon her story of the enduring power of memory, narrative, and human presence. As historians and cultural commentators continued to explore her life, the subtle lessons embedded within Marie Antoinette's story became increasingly apparent. The interplay of public scrutiny and private reflection offered enduring insights into human behavior under pressure, illustrating how character, judgment, and composure can influence perception far beyond immediate circumstances. Each retelling highlighted the delicate balance between vulnerability and resilience, reminding audiences that the echoes of personal action extend well beyond the temporal bounds of individual experience. Through this lens, her life became both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, a testament to the complexity of navigating responsibility, expectation, and human frailty. Her story also illuminated the ways in which memory is constructed and reconstructed over time. Personal accounts, public records, artistic portrayals, and literary adaptations each contributed layers of interpretation, creating a multifaceted understanding of her legacy. The convergence of these sources provided texture and depth, revealing the subtle interplay between historical fact, personal perception, and cultural imagination. By engaging with these diverse perspectives, audiences could access a richer comprehension of her experiences, understanding that history is as much about interpretation and reflection as it is about events themselves. Even the myths and legends that emerged around her persona served to highlight enduring themes relevant to both her time and ours. Tales of elegance, extravagance, and human fallibility became symbolic touchstones, illustrating the consequences of social expectation, the fragility of reputation, and the capacity for resilience in the face of adversity. While these stories sometimes blurred the line between fact and fiction, they also reinforced the enduring fascination with her life, ensuring that her presence remained vivid in cultural memory. In this way, myth and reality intertwined to shape a legacy that was dynamic, instructive, and deeply human. Ultimately, the echoes of Marie Antoinette's life underscore the enduring power of memory, reflection, and narrative. Through centuries of interpretation, her story has persisted as a symbol of resilience, elegance, and human complexity. Each account, artistic rendering, and scholarly study adds to a layered understanding, preserving the nuances of her character and the intricacies of her experience. In listening to these echoes, audiences are invited to reflect not only on the past, but also on the timeless interplay between human choice, circumstance, and the enduring resonance of a life lived under extraordinary conditions. In considering Marie Antoinette's legacy, one cannot overlook the quiet dignity with which her story continues to be retold. Each echo of her life carries with it not only the details of a bygone era, but also the subtle reminders of how individuals shape and are shaped by history. Her journey, marked by both privilege and suffering, continues to resonate because it reflects truths that are universally human. The weight of responsibility, the fragility of perception, and the capacity for endurance even when the odds are insurmountable. In remembering her, we are invited to contemplate not merely the fate of a queen, but the shared experience of humanity in the face of trial. The continued fascination with her story also demonstrates how history itself is not static, but alive, breathing and reshaped with each new generation that encounters it. For some, she remains a symbol of excess and the dangers of detachment from reality. For others, she emerges as a figure of resilience, grace, and personal courage in the shadow of catastrophe. These contrasting interpretations reveal as much about those who retell her story as they do about the queen herself, reminding us that legacy is as much a reflection of the present as it is of the past. Even in the silence left behind after her final days, Marie Antoinette's voice seems to linger, not in words, but in the lessons drawn from her existence. Her presence is felt in every discussion of leadership and responsibility, in every debate about perception and truth, and in every recognition of the resilience that defines the human spirit. It is through these echoes that she endures, not as a distant relic, but as a living reminder of the power of memory, reflection, and narrative to transcend the limits of time. And so, as we close this journey through her final days and lasting legacy, we are left with a simple yet profound realization. History whispers to us not only through grand events, but through the quiet resilience of those who lived them. Marie Antoinette's story is not confined to the walls of Versailles or the turmoil of revolutionary France. It continues to ripple outward, inviting us to listen, to reflect, and to carry forward the timeless echoes of her humanity. In remembering her, we are reminded of ourselves, of the choices we face, and of the enduring truth that the human spirit, though tested, continues to whisper across the centuries. As we reach the end of this journey through the final days and lasting echoes of Marie Antoinette, it becomes clear that her life was never just about royalty or revolution, but about the deeply human story of resilience, fragility, and the ways in which memory continues to speak across centuries. Her presence lingers in history, not because she was flawless, but because she was complex, at times misunderstood, at times admired, yet always impossible to forget. In revisiting her story, we are reminded that the past is not silent. It breathes through every retelling, shaping the way we see ourselves and the choices we face in the present. If you've found meaning in this exploration of her journey, with all its triumphs and sorrows, has stirred your curiosity, I invite you to stay connected with us. By subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or sharing your thoughts in the comments, you help keep these echoes alive, ensuring that history continues to be not only remembered, but experienced together. Each gesture of support is more than a click. It is part of a larger conversation, a way of building a community that values reflection, storytelling, and the lessons time has carried to us. And so, as the final words fade and the story of Marie Antoinette returns to the silence of history, I thank you for walking this path with me. May her echoes continue to inspire thought, dialogue, and a deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. Until our next journey into the past, take care, and may the whispers of history continue to find their way to you.